In a cold military briefing room, a young female soldier stood at attention while a two-star general destroyed her in front of 200 personnel. His voice echoed with rage, stripping her dignity for uniform violations. She took every word in silence, face calm, shoulders square. When dismissed, she walked out with a bearing that didn't match someone just publicly humiliated. What the general didn't know was that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career. Days later, during a catastrophic training accident, she would take command and save 4 lives with impossible skill. Then a 3-star general arrived unannounced and saluted her, revealing her true identity. Before we dive in, tell us in comment where in the world you are watching from. The briefing room went dead silent except for one voice, and that voice was destroying her. Major General William Hartwick stood at the front of the auditorium, 2 stars gleaming on his shoulders, face red with the kind of anger that makes junior officers check their own uniforms twice. His target stood at rigid attention 3 rows back. A young woman in ACUs, couldn't have been more than late 20s, eyes fixed on some invisible point above his head. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across rows of seated personnel who had suddenly become very interested in not being noticed themselves. This, the general barked, jabbing a finger in her direction, is exactly what I'm talking about. Lack of discipline, lack of respect. You walk into my briefing with unauthorized patches, improper blousing, and the audacity to think regulations don't apply to you. His voice carried that particular edge of authority that comes from decades of subordinates snapping to attention at the sound of his footsteps. 200 personnel sat frozen in their seats, caught between the instinct to watch and the wisdom to look away. Some stayed at their boots with sudden fascination. A few junior officers exchanged glances, smirking, fresh entertainment before lunch, a break from the monotony of PowerPoint slides and policy updates. Others looked uncomfortable, like they wanted to be anywhere else, their discomfort written across faces that had seen plenty of ass chewings but somehow sensed this one was different. The soldier didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't offer excuses or explanations. Her shoulders stayed square, her jaw set, her hands perfectly aligned at her sides in a position of attention so precise it could have been used in a training manual. She took every word like she'd been through worse, much worse, and knew that words, no matter how loud, were just noise in the end. When I ask you a question, soldier, you answer me. Hartwick's voice cracked across the room like a drill sergeant's, though he was far beyond needing to prove anything with volume. Do you understand that your behavior reflects on this entire command? That when you show up looking like you rolled out of bed and grabbed whatever uniform was closest, you disrespect every person in this room who took the time to meet the standard? Yes, sir. Her voice was steady, calm, almost eerily so for someone being eviscerated in front of her peers. There was no tremor, no hint of emotion, just 2 words delivered with the kind of control that suggested she'd learned long ago how to compartmentalize, how to endure. I don't think you do. I think you believe you're special, that somehow the rules everyone else follows don't apply to you. The general paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke, making sure every person in that room understood the lesson being taught. They do. And if I see this again, you'll be filing paperwork for the rest of your assignment here. Are we clear? Crystal clear, sir. Dismissed. The word came out like a door slamming shut. She executed a perfect about face, sharp, controlled, textbook, the kind of movement that takes thousands of repetitions to make automatic. Then she walked, and that's when some people noticed something odd. She didn't slump, didn't rush, didn't carry herself like someone who'd just been publicly destroyed. Her stride was measured, purposeful, the kind of movement drilled into someone over thousands of hours until it becomes as natural as breathing. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow felt louder than all the general shouting. General Hartwick turned back to his slides, already moving on to the next agenda item, completely satisfied he'd made his point. What the general didn't know was that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career. The story spread across the base like wildfire, the way all good humiliations do in close quarters where entertainment is scarce and gossip is currency. By the next morning, everyone knew about the general's latest target. and the whispers followed her wherever she went. "There goes Hartwick's favorite punching bag," a first lieutenant muttered in the chow hall, loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. His buddies laughed into their coffee, watching as she moved through the line with her tray. Eyes forward, expression unreadable. "I heard she tried to pull some connections to get out of following regs. Guess that didn't work out so well." The theories multiplied with each retelling, growing more elaborate and less charitable. Some assumed she was incompetent, the kind of soldier who goes through on minimum effort and gets shocked when someone actually holds them accountable. Others whispered about nepotism. Maybe she had a family member who got her stationed here, some favor that bought her a posting but couldn't protect her from her own laziness. A few speculated she was just another washout waiting to be transferred, counting down days until she could fade into some desk job where standards were suggestions rather than requirements. Nobody knew the real story, but that had never stopped soldiers from filling in the blanks with whatever narrative fit their mood. But then there were the details that didn't quite fit, small incongruities that emerged for anyone paying close attention. She arrived at the PT field every morning when it was still dark, a full hour before the official formation time, and ran alone on the perimeter track. A few early risers noticed her pace, the kind of sustainable speed that looks effortless but leaves seasoned infantrymen gasping when they try to match it. She didn't run like someone trying to pass a fitness test. She ran like someone for whom physical excellence was simply a baseline, a non-negotiable foundation of existence. In the gym during all phase, she moved through exercises with mechanical precision, each movement controlled and deliberate. No grunting, no showboating, no checking her phone between sets. Just work. Clean, efficient, relentless. The weight she handled would have impressed most of the men on base, but she approached it with the same neutral expression she wore everywhere else, as if moving heavy objects was merely a task to be completed rather than an achievement to be celebrated. The oddest moment came during a tactical briefing 2 days after her public dressing down. The operations officer was walking through mission parameters for a hypothetical scenario, and a slide flashed up showing terrain analysis and grid coordinates for some remote valley. She sat in the back row, as she always did, and under her breath, so quietly that only the people immediately around her could hear, she said, "That's wrong. Those coordinates put you in the river, not the ridge." The master sergeant running the brief paused mid-sentence. He looked at the slide, then at her, then back at the slide. His eyes narrowed slightly, the way someone looks when they're trying to place a face they almost recognize. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across his expression, before he cleared his throat and moved on without comment. But he didn't correct the slide, and he didn't dismiss her observation. He just filed it away, the way experienced soldiers do when something doesn't add up but they're not ready to ask questions yet. She kept to herself in every other context. Ate alone in the chow hall, always at the same corner table with her back to the wall. Never joined the informal gatherings in the common areas where soldiers decompressed with stories and complaints. Never responded to the mockery, never defended herself, never seemed to care what anyone thought. The contrast was stark and impossible to miss. While everyone else was loud, aggressive, eager to prove themselves in the endless status games that define military life, she remained silent, controlled, seemingly indifferent to the very hierarchies that consumed everyone around her. "What's her deal, anyway?" a junior officer finally asked one evening, watching her leave the gym after another punishing workout that no one else had witnessed. The staff sergeant next to him just shrugged, his expression suggesting he'd stopped trying to figure it out. "Hell if I know, sir. Hell if I know." The clues started piling up for anyone willing to see them. Small fractures in the narrative that had been constructed around her, inconsistencies that whispered of something deeper beneath the surface. It happened during a routine vehicle inspection in the motor pool, the kind of tedious maintenance check that everyone dreaded but no one questioned. A convoy of MRPs sat in formation, and mechanics were going through their checklist with the glazed efficiency of people who'd done this 1,000 times before. She was walking past, not assigned to the detail, just passing through, when she stopped mid-stride and stared at one of the vehicles. For a moment she just stood there, head tilted slightly, Then she approached the sergeant supervising the inspection. "The re-axle assembly on that third truck," she said quietly, pointing. "Someone torqued those bolts in the wrong sequence. See how the housing is sitting? That's going to crack the differential casing within 50 miles, maybe less if you hit rough terrain." The sergeant blinked at her, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "With respect, these trucks just came out of. I know what they came out of. Check the housing alignment. You'll see the stress fractures starting." He did, mostly to prove her wrong, and his face went pale when he saw exactly what she'd described. That kind of failure under load would have been catastrophic, the kind of mechanical disaster that ends with a disabled vehicle in hostile territory and a lot of very difficult questions afterward. It wasn't something you learned in a classroom or spotted in a manual. It was the kind of knowledge that came from seeing what happens when things go wrong in places where wrong means people don't come home. The incident should have earned her recognition, or at least a grudging acknowledgement, but instead it just added another layer to the mystery that surrounded her like smoke. 2 days later, a visiting colonel from JSOC was walking through the headquarters building, moving with the purposeful stride of someone important passing through on their way to somewhere more important. He walked right past her in the hallway, took 3 more steps, then stopped. She'd already frozen, her back still turned to him, shoulders tensing in a way that suggested she knew exactly who was behind her. The colonel turned around slowly, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that looked almost like shock. He opened his mouth, clearly about to say something, but she gave the smallest, almost imperceptible shake of her head, just a tiny movement that anyone not looking directly at her would have missed entirely. The colonel closed his mouth. He stood there for another few seconds, looking like a man who'd just seen a ghost and wasn't sure whether to trust his own eyes, then turned and walked away quickly. His entire demeanor changed. He looked shaken in a way that full-bird colonels with decades of service rarely look, like he'd stumbled onto something he hadn't been cleared to know and needed to pretend he'd never seen it. In the barracks that evening, one of the other soldiers noticed something while they were changing after PT. There was a tattoo on her forearm, faded and partially obscured by a thick scar that looked like it had required serious medical intervention to close. The tattoo was small, easy to miss if you weren't looking, but unmistakable once you saw it. A trident, the kind with a very specific meaning in certain communities. "That ink," the soldier said, trying to sound casual. "Where'd you get that?" She glanced down at her arm like she'd forgotten it was there, then pulled her sleeve down with deliberate care. "Old mistake," she said flatly. "From another life." The answer invited more questions, but her tone made it clear the conversation was over. The whispers intensified after that, spreading through different channels now. Not the mess hall gossip, but the quieter conversations that happened between senior NCOs and experienced officers. A signals officer mentioned, almost casually, that her security clearance was unusually high for her apparent rank, the kind of clearance that required congressional notification. When someone tried to pull up her personnel file out of curiosity, they found page after page of redacted information, black bars covering everything except the most basic biographical data. General Hartwick, meanwhile, continued his campaign with the oblivious confidence of someone who believed he was teaching necessary lessons. He singled her out for minor infractions, boots not shined to his standard, a uniform item slightly out of place, arriving to a formation 30 seconds after he thought she should have. He used her as a convenient example of what not to do, a cautionary tale he could reference whenever he wanted to make a point about discipline and standards. His officers enabled this behavior, sensing it pleased him and wanting to stay on his good side, adding their own small cruelties to the pile. But Master Sergeant Torres, a quiet man with 3 combat deployments and a chest full of ribbons he never talked about, had stopped participating in the jokes. He watched her differently now, with the kind of attention that came from recognition rather than curiosity. He'd seen something in the way she moved through spaces, the way she read terrain on maps during briefings with an intimacy that suggested personal familiarity, the way she went completely silent whenever certain units were mentioned in conversation. DevGru, CG, SMU. He didn't say anything, didn't ask questions, didn't defend her publicly. But he stopped laughing, and in the strange social calculus of military culture, that silence spoke volumes. The training exercise was supposed to be challenging but controlled, a large-scale simulation designed to test the battalion's readiness under pressure. General Hartwick had personally designed the scenario, adding what he called a surprise element to keep his officers sharp and ensure they couldn't simply follow a predictable script. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly controlled pressure could become uncontrolled chaos. It started with a communications breakdown during a simulated hostile engagement, radio squawking with overlapping traffic as multiple units tried to report contact simultaneously. Then the live-fire portion of the exercise, blank rounds meant to add realism, created confusion about which sectors were hot and which were safe for movement. Officers started issuing contradictory orders, each one trying to assert control over their piece of the puzzle without seeing the full picture. The fog of war that the exercise was meant to simulate had become all too real, and the carefully planned scenario was unraveling in real time. Then everything went catastrophically wrong. An MRAP taking evasive maneuvers during the simulated engagement hit a washout in the terrain that shouldn't have been there, the kind of ground shift that happens after heavy rain and doesn't show up on week-old reconnaissance photos. The vehicle lurched sideways, its weight and momentum carrying it into a roll that seemed to happen in slow motion. 20 tons of armored steel tumbled down an embankment, coming to rest on its side with a grinding crash that echoed across the training range. Weiss, fuel was leaking from a ruptured line, pooling beneath the vehicle where hot metal and electrical systems created a dozen potential ignition sources. 4 soldiers were trapped inside, their voices crackling over the radio in bursts of panic and pain. Chaos erupted across the command frequency. Officers froze, their training suddenly inadequate for a crisis that had crossed the line from simulation to genuine emergency. Some issued orders, then countermanded them seconds later. Others demanded information that nobody had, their voices rising in pitch and urgency. General Hartwick arrived at the Tactical Operations Center and started shouting into radios, trying to impose order through volume and authority, but his commands only added another layer to the confusion. Units were asking for clarification while the clock ticked and fuel continued to leak and the trapped soldiers screamed for help that wasn't coming fast enough. In the middle of this pandemonium, she appeared at the scene like she'd materialized from nowhere, covered in dust from having sprinted across a quarter-mile of open ground. She didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for orders, didn't check with anyone about the chain of command or proper procedures. She simply took control with a voice that cut through the noise like a blade. Cease all movement within 50 meters of the vehicle. Kill the engines, now. Her words were calm, authoritative, precise, not loud, but somehow carrying across the confusion with absolute clarity. Second squad, I need your heavy extrication tools staged at the 12 o'clock position. Third squad, foam and blankets on that fuel leak immediately. Fourth squad, establish a security perimeter and clear the approach vector from the northeast. That's your only angle that doesn't put you in the fuel runoff. She moved while she spoke, directing extraction teams with tactical language that sounded like it had come straight from a Joint Special Operations Command Center. She called out equipment by military designations most people on that field had never heard, referenced extraction protocols that weren't in any standard manual, and coordinated the rescue with the efficiency of someone who had done this before under actual enemy fire where mistakes measured in seconds meant the difference between living and dying. I need trauma supplies ready for potential spinal injury and at least 1 compound fracture. Get the medevac spun up but keep them at standby distance until we have the vehicle stabilized. Rotor wash will spread those fuel vapors. She was at the vehicle now, assessing the situation with quick, practiced movements. Hydraulic jack on the rear quarter panel, not the door. You'll crush them if you try to force that angle. Stabilize first, then we extract through the roof hatch. The teams moved to execute her orders without question, responding to the absolute certainty in her voice the way trained soldiers respond to competent leadership. Within minutes that felt like hours to everyone watching, the trapped soldiers were out of the vehicle, conscious and accounted for, the fuel leak contained, and the immediate crisis neutralized. The exercise had been stabilized not through the established chain of command, but through the intervention of someone who had instantly recognized what needed to be done and possessed the knowledge to do it. Everyone stared at her. She stood there near the overturned MRP, covered in dust and hydraulic fluid, her uniform darkened with sweat and streaked with the grime of emergency work. Her face remained unreadable, neutral, as if she'd simply completed a routine task rather than orchestrated a high-stakes rescue that had probably saved 4 lives. General Hartwick arrived on scene in his vehicle, dismounting with the clear intention of exploding at whoever had taken over his command without authorization. His face was already red, his mouth open to deliver what would undoubtedly be another devastating public rebuke. Then he saw who was standing at the center of the organized chaos, and he stopped dead. The color drained from his face as recognition and confusion fought for dominance in his expression. She turned to face him, still calm, still controlled, making no move to explain or justify her actions. Just standing there, waiting, with the kind of patience that comes from knowing you did exactly what needed to be done. "So," a young officer whispered from beside the general, his voice barely audible but carrying in the sudden silence. "Sir, she just saved 4 lives." The general's face went from red to pale, his mouth working soundlessly as he tried to process what he'd just witnessed. For the first time since anyone on that base had known him, Major General William Hartwick had absolutely nothing to say. Section 5. The Reveal and Reversal. Within an hour, the distant sound of rotor blades cut through the afternoon air, growing louder as an unmarked Black Hawk descended toward the training area's landing zone. Nobody had been notified of any incoming VIP visits, and the sudden arrival sent a ripple of confusion through the assembled personnel who were still processing what had just happened at the overturned MRP. The helicopter touched down, and 2 figures emerged through the dust cloud. The first was a 3-star general, stars gleaming on his shoulders even through the haze. The second was a civilian in a dark suit, the kind of nondescript professional attire that somehow screamed federal government. JSOC, maybe higher, the sort of person whose business card would have more redactions than information. They moved with purpose, walking directly past the officers who scrambled to attention, past General Hartwick who stood frozen in place, past everyone else, heading straight toward her. She cleaned up slightly, wiped some of the hydraulic fluid off her hands, but she still looked like someone who'd just crawled through a disaster zone. She came to attention as the 3-star approached, her movements automatic and precise. What happened next made everyone within sight stop breathing. The 3-star general rendered a full salute. Not the casual gesture of acknowledgement that senior officers sometimes give, but a deliberate, formal salute that carried the weight of genuine respect. She returned it, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or the kind of understanding that exists between people who've operated in the same shadows. The base went completely silent. General Hartwick's face drained of all color, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the dawning horror of someone who's just realized they've made a catastrophic miscalculation. The 3-star turned to address the assembled formation, his voice carrying across the field with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Some of you don't know who you've been serving with," he began, and the words landed like artillery rounds. "This is Senior Chief Sarah McKenna, retired Navy SEAL, recipient of the Silver Star and 2 Bronze Stars with Vela. She completed 4 deployments to classified theaters, led direct action missions that saved American lives, and was part of a hostage rescue operation that never made the news because it couldn't make the news. She's here completing her degree under the GI Bill and volunteered to support your training rotations." The silence deepened, became absolute. People weren't just quiet. They'd stopped moving, stopped breathing, turned into statues as the information rewrote everything they thought they knew. The 3-star continued, his voice steady and measured as he read from a record that most of them would never be cleared to see in full. Counterterrorism operations in 3 continents. High-value target captures that had changed the strategic landscape. Close-quarters combat instructor for special mission units whose names were classified above top secret. A career of service conducted almost entirely in the shadows, where success meant silence and recognition meant compromise. General Hartwick stood rigid, his body language screaming discomfort and shock. Every word he'd said to her in that briefing room, every public humiliation, every dismissive comment, all of it was echoing in his mind now, recontextualized by the truth he hadn't bothered to discover. His officers stood around him, equally frozen, their earlier mockery turning to ash in their mouths. The three-star turned toward Hartwick, his expression neutral but his meaning clear. "General, I believe you and Senior Chief McKenna have met." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Hartwick's jaw worked, his face red again but now with shame rather than anger. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, and found no anger in her eyes. No satisfaction, no vindication, no desire for revenge. Just quiet professionalism, the same expression she'd worn through every humiliation he'd inflicted on her. "Senior Chief," he managed, his voice hoarse and stripped of its usual commanding tone. I apologize." She nodded once, a single acknowledgement that carried no malice. "No apology necessary, sir. I'm just here to learn." The grace of that response made what had happened to her somehow worse and her response to it somehow better. She could have destroyed him with a word, could have leveraged this moment into career-ending consequences for a general who'd publicly abused someone whose service record dwarfed his own. Instead, she chose dignity. The three-star shook her hand, a gesture of respect between warriors who understood what it meant to serve in the places where medals are earned but rarely given. The civilian in the suit stepped forward, spoke quietly, something about continued discretion and appreciation for her service. Then they turned and walked back to the helicopter. Within minutes, they were gone, lifting off and disappearing into the sky as suddenly as they'd arrived. General Hartwick remained standing there in the settling dust, watching her walk back toward the barracks, every ounce of his earlier arrogance stripped away and replaced by the heavy knowledge of what he'd done and who he'd done it to. The base transformed overnight in ways both visible and subtle. Officers who had mocked her now found reasons to look elsewhere when she passed, or offered quiet nods of respect that she returned with the same neutral professionalism she'd always shown. The jokes disappeared entirely, replaced by a reverent silence that followed her like a wake. Master Sergeant Torres approached her 3 days later outside the gym, waited until she'd finished her workout and was heading back to the barracks. "Senior Chief," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood what those words meant. "It was an honor." She stopped, turned to face him, and for the first time since anyone on that base had known her, she smiled, just slightly, just enough. "Thank you, Master Sergeant. The honor was mine." General Hartwick never publicly addressed what had happened, but those who worked closest to him noticed the change. He was less loud, less certain, more careful with his words. He still commanded, still led, but the edge of arrogance that had defined him had been filed away by the knowledge of his own blindness. And she continued exactly as before. Early morning PT when the sky was still dark. Classes at the education center. Solitary meals at her corner table. She hadn't come for recognition or vindication. She'd come to move forward, to build something new after years of service in places most people would never know existed. Because in every room, there are people carrying stories we'll never know. Battles fought in silence. Sacrifices made without applause. The uniform doesn't always tell the full story, and rank doesn't measure character. Before you judge someone, remember, you might be standing in front of a hero who doesn't need you to know it. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another story like this one. Comment below where you're watching from, and if you've ever met someone whose quiet strength changed your perspective. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and never forget, respect is owned in the shadows long before it's given in the light.